Shalom and welcome to Jewish Insights. If you've been watching this show at all, you know that I'm very interested in the Jewish calendar and looking to the Jewish calendar to raise different questions for us at different times of the year. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to look at the American calendar. We're going to look at Thanksgiving. We're in the season, the Zman, let's say, of Thanksgiving. And what I want to think about and explore today with my guest, Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm, is how the Jewish ideas have actually shaped the American experience and the American calendar. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm is the chief executive of BZ Media. He produces Israel content for young audiences outside the Jewish community. He is the host of the Good Faith Effort podcast on the Bible and society and created the popular Twitter, or I guess now X series, Why I Read the Bible in Hebrew. For his leadership in the world of Jewish ideas, the Jerusalem Post recently ranked him number 37 on its list of the world's most 50 influential Jews. Rabbi Lamm earned his rabbinical ordination from Yeshiva University's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary and his PhD in religion from Princeton University. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Tablet Magazine, Sapir Journal, and the Jerusalem Post. Our souls were perhaps introduced originally when his grandfather, Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm Zatzal, was very close with my father-in-law, Dr. Tzachi Goldberg. And we were reintroduced when we were both fellows in the Wexner Graduate Fellowship, and again by our mutual friend, Dan Luxembourg. Perhaps most importantly, and speaking of the cross-influence of Jews and America, we both love the game of basketball and have the blessing of enjoying our daughters enjoy the game we love. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm.
Rabbi Pines, let's go.
Let's go. I'm so excited you're here. I don't know how we're going to do this in an hour. I have so much to talk to you about, but we'll figure it out. First, let's just start with, before we get to the work you're doing and what you're thinking about and Thanksgiving and BZ Media, a little bit about yourself, your inspirations growing up. I hope we'll touch on your grandfather as well.
Sure. Look, it's in a certain sense, it's quite simple, right? Mm-hmm. When you grow up and your grandfather is a person of significance, and you had that experience as well.
Mm-hmm. We just realized that you have a baby Norman Lamm at home, and I have a baby Murray Pantera Pines at home. So
exactly, old man babies are just the absolute best.
Am Yisrael Chai.
Exactly. Od Avinu Chai.
Od Avinu Chai. Od Avinu Chai. Even better.
So when you grow up, and it really, I suppose it doesn't matter. Like whatever your grandparents do, your parents do, they're not those people to you. They're just your parents or your grandparents. So growing up, my grandfather was Zaida, and that was how I knew him. But nevertheless, it was just readily apparent to anyone who knew him, but certainly even to family and even to little kids, that he was a person of extraordinary gravitas. And so we kind of naturally all gravitated towards him, and he became a teacher to all of us. And so growing up, that was the one real North Star that I had. And I was fortunate enough to be able to learn with him for many years. And now that he's passed, his example looms quite large. And there are all those conversations, you wish you could have with a person like that you can't now. But the conversations you had while they were alive have to stand you in good stead until the redemption. So that's where we're at.
Amazing. I'll say a couple things from the humble and faraway spot that I'm sitting is my most real encounter with him was they put together kind of his drashot, his Torah portion speeches in a 5-book series, and they are so deeply relevant today. It's wild. It's unbelievable. You're like, oh my God, this is so many years old, and if someone gave it this weekend, it would be perfect and powerful. So that's first of all, which really sits with me a lot. And I'll say that almost anytime I've heard a story about him, in addition to everything he did for YU and for Torah and all those places, I get the vibe that he's one of these people who was able to see so far down the line. I heard a story recently, the way he thought about Birthright was not only the impact of the program Birthright, but also the sense that this size program would shape Jewish philanthropy and the type of money we put into Jewish philanthropy. And I think being the type of person to really see the whole field and not just see 2 days in front of you is whoa. But we could talk for hours about him. I guess what I'll ask you is...
By the way, I'll tell you, the crazy thing is, it's not just that, when you read his sermons, and that's a very common, it's a very common thing that you'll hear. It's they're so relevant, it could have just been written today. And it's true. What's even more remarkable about it is that you'll see a sermon that he wrote in 1953, and it's so erudite and sagacious and far-sighted. And then you look at the date, and it's 1953, and you're he wrote this when he was 26. Wow.
It's just that's a whole separate thing. Wow. All right, so give us one, with respect and privacy to your family, will you share with me, I'm sure there's many of these, but, share me, one thing that sticks out in your mind, an interaction that was in the Lamm home and not on the YU stage.
for many years we had a chavrusa together. We had a study partnership together, and I was dying for that closeness, and I was really willing to take anything. So, when he asked, like, what would you like to learn together, I just sort of said, anything.
Yeah. And
it was myself and my good friend Menachem Butler and my cousin John Lamm. We had a chavrusa together with my grandfather, and he insisted that we study what are called hakdamos. So what that means is, introduction to great Jewish books.
Got it.
And, typically, you read an introduction to a book, it's just sort of stage setting. But if you read an introduction to a work of Jewish intellectual history, that's really where the theological worldview and personality of the author is going to come out. The book is typically going to be subject matter expertise and real density.
Sure.
But in the introduction, that's where he felt very strongly that you're going to get a worldview. So we would just go through introductions to some of the great and also obscure works of Jewish life and history. And I'll never forget, he insisted the first one that we were going to do, I would assume it would be something like the introduction to either one of his books, or the introduction to Rabbi Soloveitchik's work, or an introduction by, the Netziv, one of the great, early modern commentators on the Talmud and on the Bible and on some of the works of rabbinic literature.
Sure.
Something like that. No. It was the introduction to Vayol Moshe. Vayol Moshe is probably the great anti-Zionist work by the head of the Satmar sect of Hasidic Judaism. It was, as a theological statement, as deeply opposed to everything my grandfather believed as you could possibly imagine, but he felt very strongly that that was where we should start. And it was sort of befuddling to me, but as we got into it, I remember having this moment, and I actually kept my notes on all of those study sessions, and I was going through it about a year ago when we were kind of cleaning out a room. And I saw that I had annotated at the very beginning of the introduction to this work, Vayol Moshe, he's, the Satmar Rebbe is going on a tirade against those Zionist thinkers, and listen, he said the secular ones you can, they're also horrible, but you can excuse them. It's the religious ones who went over to Zionism that are the real causes of the Holocaust and all that sort of stuff. And
this is written around when?
This is like,
post-Holocaust.
Yeah, well, this is post-Holocaust.
The safer post-Holocaust, great. Okay,
and all the ideas are germinating pre-Holocaust, but yeah.
Okay.
So as I'm reading it and annotating it, I wrote a note that said, it sounds like he's describing Zaida. And he was describing everything my grandfather represented. And my grandfather, we did not read this work to refute it. We read it to understand it.
Right.
And to me, it was such a personal example that I've carried with me ever since of being not just able, but willing and proud to engage with people who disagree with you really fundamentally, because that's how, A, you're going to make your ideas better, but B, my grandfather was never quite certain. He was never quite certain that he was right about anything. He always felt strongly and passionately about the things he believed, and he would argue for them, and he wrote books in defending his positions, but he always had doubts in the back of his mind, which he thought were healthy, and he cultivated, that he might be wrong.
Right.
And because the Jewish tradition, and really any great intellectual tradition, but because the Jewish tradition is so saturated with people of enormous wisdom and understanding, he felt strongly, at least as I experienced it, that the best way to the truth is to collect as many voices from amongst those who are great and good as possible, and that's how you get to the right place. So that's a strong memory I have of studying that together.
So first of all, thank you for bringing that into the space. Holy cow. So powerful. I just want to make sure, for our audience following along, because to get all the facts straight there, this is your grandfather, who obviously was an ardent Zionist, a religious Zionist, right? Reading the book by kind of the leader of the most extreme opposition, for lack of a better term, someone who's using religious language to say Zionism is not the right thing. This is the head of the Satmar movement.
If anything, it's an abomination.
It's an abomination, right? Exactly. It's an abomination, so it's terrible. And he's saying the first thing we're gonna read all these famous and not famous introductions to different famous Jewish books. We're gonna start with this one, which is completely antithetical to everything that I believe, and is going after me and saying that I'm the worst of the worst. And that's where he wants to start with you.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. We need more of that in the world. That's crazy. We listen. We try, JBS. We try to reflect different views. We don't always go to the full extremes, but we try to reflect, on multiple sides of the table. And that's a really inspiring thing to take with us. Okay. Yeah. Beautiful. Okay. Wow. I'm just sitting with that for a little bit. Okay. So I was going to say speaking up, but this doesn't really say speaking up. Comparing America to Judaism. Thank God we're not enemies. We're close friends. I know that you are someone who could speak to really history broadly. I've heard you speak very, very powerfully before on European art, European history, the roles of Jews and how they influenced each other. I've actually never sat with you. I know this is a new area that I'm learning from you, but certainly it's a passion area of you, which is thinking about how American history and American values have been shaped by Jewish ideas and Jewish values. Before you even share that Torah with me, let me ask you first why you're passionate about that area.
Yeah, when I did my doctorate, I really wanted it to be in an area that I felt would actually allow me to help influence the wider society. I didn't want to study something just because I enjoyed it, although that's also important. I didn't want to study something just for the heck of it, because that was frankly not just a waste of my time, waste of my family's time, and I have a wife and kids, and when I got my doctorate, my wife, who's a dentist, so she said, you're the kind of you're a doctor like Ross Geller is a doctor, right? So not useful in a hospital setting.
Right. But that's hilarious.
Yeah. So
that's our first Friends reference on the show, but we were big Friends people.
There you go.
That's hilarious. Okay.
Exactly. Dr. Ross Geller.
There you go.
So actually, the introduction to my podcast, so that we have a voiceover artist who says, and now Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm. The voice instruction that we gave to the voice actor who did the introduction was, say Rabbi Doctor, but say it like as sarcastically as possible.
That's great. That's great.
Anyway, so I decided to study the first century. Why? Okay. Because that's the century where the entire world as we know it, not just the West, but the entire world as we know it, was shaped. It's where the Roman world had just recently relatively speaking, come into contact with Jewishness. It's the century in which Christianity is born. It's the century in which rabbinic literature is born. Every major feature of our modern world, both the receding of paganism and the rise of a Judeo-Christian ethic, and we could unpack what that term means, but broadly speaking, I think we all kind of know what it means.
Yeah.
But it's where that all begins. As I began to study that period, and I finished the doctorate on that, and as I began to teach on it, I began to ask myself questions like, okay, where does all of this shake out? So we know everything begins in the first century, or a lot at least begins in the first century, and then the 2 centuries on either side of that, but where's the payoff? Okay. So you can skip, and I used to do this, right? You can sort of like skip from the first century to the 20th century or the 21st century. There's a lot that happens in between.
That's a big skip, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot that happens in between. Now, there's a lot that happens in between that, frankly, I'm interested in and have read a lot about, but I still don't feel like I understand, like the Mongol invasion. Yeah. As far as I can tell, that was just the hand of God smiting the entire world. And by the way, that was how Genghis Khan would have explained himself, and did explain himself.
Okay.
But in between, there are not only, it's not just a matter of that's a large piece, chunk of history to skip, but there were certain features of the modern world that I could not explain just by understanding, broadly speaking, the stretch of history. So, for example, let's say you wanted to explain how the state of Israel comes into being. So there is a way that you can tell that story, and our community does it very often, where you do skip from the first century to the 21st century, which is we were exiled, we prayed for 2,000 years, and now it's been restored. Right. That's a way of skipping over 2,000 years.
Maybe throw in the Holocaust right
before
that.
Yeah. There's a little Holocaust, and then there's some pre-Holocausts, the Crusades and the Kishinev Massacre, all that kind of stuff. And also, by the way, we're not going to be so Ashkenazi-centric. There's all people that are expelled from Muslim, but it's really just a way of skipping over history and having main character syndrome. So, but here's some specific riddles that I couldn't answer, right? Because we can all critique that story by saying it's not specific enough. But even if it were specific enough, some riddles. How does the state of Israel come into being from a legal diplomatic perspective? Broadly speaking, British British and American interventions on the world stage. So the Balfour Declaration in 1917 is what kind of sets the stage in motion for Her Majesty looking with favor upon the establishment of a Jewish national home in the land of Israel. We all kind of take for granted that, well, somebody was going to have to issue a Balfour Declaration, and England happened to be in charge at the time, so England did it. Mm-hmm. If you think about of all the possible countries in the entire world that could have issued a Balfour Declaration, England would be last on my list. First of all, England invented modern, at least medieval anti-Semitism. Sure. Why do I say that? The first blood libel. So the blood libel is the concept that, and it takes on a variety of forms, but the accusation that by Christians that Jews annually and ritually hunt down Christian children and kidnap them and slaughter them in order to bake their blood into matzah for Passover or whatever. So those canards, which resulted in just untold rivers of Jewish blood, shed throughout Europe. Mm-hmm. The first blood libel is invented in England, William of Norwich. The first great massacre of Jews in medieval Europe that to this day, on the greatest day of mourning on the Jewish calendar, Tisha B'Av, when we recite laments for all the horrible things that happened in Jewish history, one of the earliest ones in the medieval period is for this. The massacre at York takes place in England. The coronation of the massacre at York is preceded by the coronation of Richard I, Richard the Lionheart. The coronation of Richard I is a day of celebration for the people of England. It results in a massacre of Jewish people. They're thrown out of the coronation and hunted down and beaten, forced to convert.
It's not good for us in England.
Yeah,
okay.
The first people that are ever expelled their Jews in 1290 is England.
Right.
Of all the places,
right?
Why England?
Okay.
So it occurred to me that if you want to understand how we get from the first century to medieval Christian anti-Semitism to the establishment of the State of Israel by a European power that was one of the greatest heirs of that medieval tradition, how could that possibly have happened? And as it turned out, there is an enormous shift underway between, roughly speaking, the 16th century and the 20th century that completely changes not only Jewish history, but the entire history of the West.
Okay.
And so it begins, I would say, with what I often call the most important non-Jewish event in Jewish history, which is the Protestant Reformation. In a nutshell, the Protestant, many people had tried to reform the church prior to Martin Luther. Martin Luther is the first one who really succeeds. Why? First of all, for a technological reason. He's the first print native, right? So the printing press becomes available, and he's one of the best-selling authors ever in the history of print, exceeded probably by God and J.K. Rowling. Okay. But Martin Luther's basically single-handedly makes the printing press into a viable technology. Okay. Because he's the first person to actually author anything that's not a Bible or excerpts from a Bible that people actually read on a wide scale. Okay. What does Martin Luther say? Martin Luther says, look, until now, the West has told itself a story about how the West has come into being. And the story goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was an ancient people who lived on the Mediterranean. Okay. And they were courageous, and they were wonderful, and they were upright, and they were curious. So curious, in fact, that they invented the systematic study of curiosity, and they called it philosophy. Those people were the Greeks. They were wonderful. In fact, their only demerit was that though they had theorized that there should be one cosmic sovereign of the universe, they didn't actually discover any god that fit that description. So they had this whole pantheon of ridiculous nonsense gods, and that was their problem. All the way on the other side of the Mediterranean, there's another ancient people, and they are not good or courageous or upright or virtuous. They are, in fact, superstitious and backwards and fractious, and they are the Jews, and their only virtue was that they had actually stumbled somehow into a relationship with a god that fit the bill of what the philosophers in Greece were looking for. The problem was they were on two opposite sides of the Mediterranean. They couldn't meet. Alexander the Great brings them together in the 4th century BC, and now the next couple of centuries were the process of working out how to bring Jerusalem and Athens together. And it is the church that actually makes that a reality. The church is the synthesis of the wisdom of Athens with the God of Jerusalem. Fine. So Martin Luther, and therefore, if you want to know how to be a good person, you want to know how to behave, you obey, the head of the replacement people of Jerusalem, the church, you need to basically study the traditions and the wisdom and the scholastic wisdom of the God of Athens. So read Aristotle and Plato and Aquinas and Augustine and do what the Pope tells you. Martin Luther comes along and says, it's a wonderful story. It's also idolatrous. Because, in fact, if you want to know how to behave, you actually don't need to ask Plato and Aristotle. If you want to know how our God wants us to behave, he's actually given us an entire instruction manual, the Bible. So you should read the Bible. Now that might sound like something we would take for granted, like everyone should just read the Bible, right?
Yeah.
The fact is nobody was reading the Bible. Unless you were a priest, unless you were trained to do it, you were discouraged from reading the Bible. Translating the Bible into a vernacular language was illegal in most places. I ask people this all the time, like, who was the first guy to translate the Bible from Hebrew into English? Who's the first guy? We should all know that guy's name. No one knows his name. It was William Tyndale. Why does no one know that name? Because his reward for this monumental feat of scholarship was he was burned at the stake.
Wow.
So, no one's reading the Bible. Martin Luther comes along and he publishes a vernacular translation of the Bible, and the world is never the same. People start reading this thing, and they're like, this thing is chock full of stuff that I assumed was not in here. So for example, if you want to know, what's the most essential question that Europe is facing both on the eve of the Reformation and especially after the Reformation with the rise of the wars of religion, the bloodiest wars in the history of Europe, until the World Wars? How do we have a virtuous, functional political order? For example, a very basic but important question. So, if all you know of the Bible are the gospel stories, and that everything else before that is just an anticipation of the gospel stories,
right.
So you would assume, rightly, that the Bible just has no political wisdom to teach. It's interested in other things. Right. That's fine.
Yeah.
It just has no political wisdom to teach. So you go to Aristotle, right? And Aristotle will tell you, how do you have a good, virtuous political order? Constitutional pluralism. So you can have government by all the people, by some of the people, by one person, and there are good and bad forms of both. There's monarchy, which is a good form of government by one person. There's tyranny, which is a bad form of government by one person.
Sure.
Same thing for aristocracy versus oligarchy, just constitutionalism versus democracy, etc. All of a sudden, people read the book of Deuteronomy, and they're like, this thing talks about government.
Yeah.
This is about setting up a state in the land of the Israelites.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the greatest political thinkers, literally in the history of the West, start, first of all, learning Hebrew. They start trying to read this book, and they start mining it for insight into everything from personal virtue to political wisdom. And they immediately run into a problem. And their problem is, this book is hard to understand. So we need to be able to ask questions about this. Normally, in years past, in generations past, we'd ask the priest. We can't ask the priest. Why? We don't trust the priest. Because they've hidden this from us for so long. Or because we're Protestant and they're Catholic, whatever. We don't trust, as Luther called them, the whore of Babylon. So, not to mince words. So,
ask the Jews.
Ask the Jews. They're the only ones who can read this thing, who can do it in Hebrew, and have a tradition of doing it for a very long time, and are not beholden to Rome.
Bring in the rabbi.
Yeah. So in England, for example, they have a major problem with this. So Henry VIII, for example, wants to get divorced from Catherine of Aragon.
Right.
And he's trying to say, well, we have to listen to the law in Leviticus because Catherine had been, what's his excuse for getting divorced from her? You're not allowed to get divorced if you're a Catholic. Well, she had been married to my brother. You're not allowed to marry your brother's wife. That's what the verse in Leviticus says. The Pope counters and says, but when you married her, when she was married to your brother, he died before they had children. And the verse in Deuteronomy says that if your brother dies and doesn't have
heirs.
children, doesn't have heirs, you marry your brother's widow. So the verse in Deuteronomy says you have to marry her. So Henry VIII says, well, we have to resolve this. I can't ask the Pope because I don't trust him.
Yeah.
So let's ask the Jews. Why didn't they ask the Jews in England? They had expelled their Jews in 1290, so they were out of luck. So they send emissaries.
We need Jews, we don't have any Jews.
Yeah, exactly. Just when you need them, they're gone.
Sure.
Long story, very long story. Short,
Yeah.
what happens as a consequence of this is people start to encounter Jewish wisdom and learning, and not just biblical literature, rabbinic literature, and they say, this stuff is great.
Yeah.
And they start to translate it. So in the 16th and 17th centuries, here's what gets translated. Some of the greatest works of Jewish thought and philosophy and grammar of all time, from the Talmud to the works of Maimonides, one of the great medieval scholars, his philosophical works, his juridical works, some of the great works of commentators with names like Rashi, Radak, Ibn Ezra. Wow. They're all translated into Latin and French and then English, etc. I mean, everything. The Jewish works of mysticism, the Zohar, is translated into Latin.
Sure.
In fact, the first person to procure a copy of the Zohar and send it to America is Benjamin Franklin. And so he sends it to a friend of his, Ezra Stiles, who becomes the president of Yale University during the American Revolution, and would go on to found Brown University. He's the person who writes a letter to Benjamin Franklin saying, "Can you get me a copy of the Zohar?" and eventually gets the first copy of the Zohar in the New World ever.
In Latin.
In Latin.
This is amazing.
He actually says in his letter to Franklin, he says. I'd love a copy of the Zohar with the Latin translation if possible, but if not, I'll take the original Hebrew. It's like a kid who goes like Shana Aleph and is for a first year studying in seminary in Israel. Is like, do me a favor, like, can you pick me up the Art Scroll version of the Zohar? But if you can find the Art Scroll version, great. If not, like, I guess I'll take the Hebrew one.
Right.
So what happens is every single one of the greatest thinkers you and our listeners have ever heard of in the history of the Western canon, from the Renaissance period and on, let's name a couple. John Milton, Thomas Hobbes, Hugo Grotius, John Locke. All of these people are what they would have called themselves at the time, and what we would certainly call them now, historians would call them now, Christian Hebraists. That's how they would have thought of themselves. And so in many respects, and we'll get into this, both 17th century England's highest aspiration, if you ask any of its greatest thinkers, was in some ways to emulate the ancient, what they called, Hebrew Republic. The Republic of the Israelites as it's described in Deuteronomy and then the subsequent books and explained by the rabbis.
And did that ever exist, that Hebrew Republic? That's like, what would you describe, the King David era? Or
So actually goes back before King David. In fact, the American founders quote Josephus and the Talmud, I mean, often, but particularly when they say, what kind of government should we aspire to create? It's a word that Josephus basically either invented or popularized, and that is, what we want is a theocracy. Benjamin Franklin actually writes about this. In fact, many of the great thinkers write about this. What do they mean by a theocracy? What they mean by a theocracy is not like the current government of Iran or something like that. What they mean, not a government ruled by priests. In fact, they mean the opposite of that. What they say is, eventually, like, for example, the question of monarchy becomes a huge issue, both in 17th century England and then, as you can imagine, at the time of the American founding. Until this Hebraic revolution, there basically was one option in English political thought, in Western political thought, and it was Aristotle. Like, basically, just choose a virtuous form of whatever government you have. So, if you want to have a monarchy, just have a good monarchy.
Make sure it's not a tyranny. Fine. So what are when they're saying, let's do this, whatever you call it, the Hebrew Republic, is that what you call it?
So they say, what kind of government
Hebrew Republic?
So what kind of government should we have? So two things happen. First, Hebraists discover the tractate of the Talmud called Sanhedrin, which, among other things, lays out the laws for civil society. And in that tractate, they find the following discussion. What are the three laws that the Israelites are expected to keep once they traverse the distance between the wilderness, the desert, and the Promised Land? Well, upon entry into the Promised Land, they have three requirements. One, and potentially in no particular order, but one, you have to destroy the Amalekites. Two, you have to build a house for God. You have to build the temple. And three, you need to appoint a king. Oh, wait a minute. Appointing a king is not just an option as long as you have a virtuous one. Maybe it's something that God actually commands us to do. That is one potential way, by the way, to read the verse about this in Deuteronomy. So all of a sudden, you have, for the very first time in the entire history of Western political thought, what historians would call the outbreak of monarchical exclusivism, which is another way of saying the idea that you not only are allowed to have a king, you actually have to have a king. It's a divine command to have a king. This, like King James of King James Bible fame, King James loves this thing from the Talmud. Like, this is his favorite, this is like his favorite Gemara in the entire, So John Milton, of Paradise Lost fame, who should probably be better known as like one of the real fathers of like republicanism, like small r republicanism and democracy. John Milton finds a rabbinic source in a rabbinic commentary on the book of Deuteronomy called Deuteronomy Rabbah. And in Deuteronomy Rabbah, he finds a source in which the rabbis say explicitly, and they quote God, and they're interpreting a verse in Jeremiah and Deuteronomy. They say, God says, once upon a time, Chashavti shetiyeh cherus min hamalchios. I intended for you to be free of kings, but you were greedy and you wanted a king, and a king is idolatrous. And in fact, that source in the commentary in Deuteronomy refers to having a king as avodah zarah, as foreign pagan worship.
Right.
So Milton finds this source, and he says, not only is having a king not a
commandment,
not a commandment, it's actually an act of idolatry. And that is the birth of what historians call Republican exclusivism, the idea that actually not only may you have a republic, governed by all the people for the people, but you have to have such a government. Now, that argument, in fact, Milton, when he quotes that source, he says, and I'm quoting Milton here, I follow the opinion of these rabbis. That line from Milton and that entire section goes dormant in English history because after the Glorious Revolution and the restoration of the House of Orange and all of that, the Stuarts, the rise of the Stuarts eventually, that kind of thing. So the English are like, you know what? We've kind of figured out how to have a king and make him basically harmless, and Parliament is fine doing their thing. So we don't need all of this. The king is an idol and we have to knock it down thing. Just let it be.
Right.
An English emigre makes his way to the 13 colonies, and he is a ne'er-do-well commoner, but he has a talent for provocative writing.
Okay.
And he writes a small pamphlet called Common Sense. His name is Thomas Paine. This is known as the match that lights the fire of the American Revolution. The central argument of Thomas Paine's Common Sense is that having a king is an act of idolatry. And in that section, he basically plagiarizes Milton's rabbinic argument.
Wow.
Later, John Adams, the second president, who hated Tom Paine because he thought he was like a jumped up peasant, accuses him. He's like, you just took your entire argument from John Milton. And Thomas Paine is like, 100% I did that. Like, that's exactly what I did. Why do I say this? Because the entire American political consciousness is shaped self-consciously by being in that rabbinic Hebraic tradition.
Wow.
So what does it mean to have a theocracy? It means if we could rewind the clock from monarchy, because after all, what's the implication, explicitly stated implication of the rabbis' argument, of Milton's argument based on the rabbis, of Tom Paine's argument based on Milton, based on the rabbis? It's that having a king, asking for a king, is actually a sin. Now, why did what happened to the Israelites asked for a king? Yeah, they asked for a king and they sinned in doing so. You know how God punished them? He gave them exactly what they asked for. That was their punishment. They had to suffer under a king. So if we could rewind back pre-monarchy to the ideal government that God envisioned, it was a theocracy. It was a government of equal citizens, of the people, by the people, for the people, whose only sovereign was God. There's no clergy that has separate authority over ecclesiastical matters and over religious matters. There's no heresy hunting. In fact, the entire birth of the American tradition of religious toleration is rooted in this idea of a theocracy.
So let me just make sure I understand. One question on that. So you're saying run by the people, and then there's I guess, God is the only God. There's no monarchy. But is there a sense that God is meant to influence, or that theology or religion is meant to influence the government?
Certainly. The entire purpose of having a society. The entire purpose of having a society is so that we can be virtuous and find our way to God. In fact, George Washington himself says in his farewell address that the essential pillar of American civic life is religion and religious feeling and morality. So the idea is that the best way to have a society that pursues God is to enable people freely to pursue God. And the kind of society that God himself wants is one where we are free to pursue him and free to be in a relationship with him, free to be in conversation with him.
Wow.
And so the entire American idea springs from that. So how does that bring us?
Yeah.
That was your question. To Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
So, if you rewind,
Right.
go back to the Pilgrims.
Yeah.
So the first Pilgrims that make their way to New England on the Mayflower are led by a variety of colorful and very impressive figures. One of the most important amongst them, who becomes the second governor of the Plymouth colony, is William Bradford. If you go up to New England and you look at Bradford's tomb, you will see on his tomb there's a big inscription in English, like here lies William Bradford, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
There's a little quote in Latin on the bottom, and on the top is a quote from Psalm 23 in Hebrew. Like, L'David Hashem or Yishi Hashem Ma'oz Chayai. It says, Hashem Ma'oz Chayai, God is the refuge of my life. Fine. In Hebrew. Wow. Why?
Yeah.
If you look at Bradford's journal,
Yeah.
and you open it up, I've actually seen the handwritten copy. You open it up, so he publishes this journal. It becomes massively popular reading in England. It's called Of Plymouth Plantation, and it's how the world is introduced to the New England experiment.
Yeah.
The first 50 pages of it are just Hebrew writing exercises. It's him practicing Hebrew.
Oh my
the
God.
first 50 pages. The opening page, where he writes like this very fancy like dedication, and he writes it in like stylized English, has nothing to do with Plymouth, has nothing to do with the New World, has nothing to do with being a governor, nothing to do with political philosophy. It's just his fervent, almost romantic desire to study the language of Hebrew. That's what it is. Why? The answer is because you could not be a serious person in society in the 17th century if you did not take Hebrew seriously as a matter of political philosophy, of social virtue, and of personal morality. You could not be a serious person.
I have to do a sidebar on that one then. I see how Jewish text was lifted up in Hebraic society. Were Jews lifted up alongside that? Or
great
they were,
question.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great question.
Yeah.
So here's where you actually have to contrast two stories, right? Bradford makes his way to Thanksgiving, to New England.
Yeah.
And the classic question we all have is like, is Thanksgiving a religious holiday? Was that first Thanksgiving really? The answer is it's kind of a red herring, because if you look at that, because that's actually not the first time that the Pilgrims give thanks in the New World. Then they describe it like, Bradford and his compatriots describe meeting the local native tribes, etc. And you could argue there's a reference to God in there, sort of, but like doesn't really seem so religious. It's totally a red herring. The first time that the Mayflower Pilgrims give thanks in the New World is when they embark at Plymouth, on Plymouth Rock, as it were, and they recite Psalm 107. Why did they recite? Of all the things they could have recited, why?
Did they recite that when? When they land?
Right when they land. The first thing they do
is recite Psalm 107.
Psalm 107, which begins, give thanks to the Lord for he is, praise the Lord for he is great, his mercies endure forever. Those who are, in Hebrew, Hodul Hashem Kitov Kilu Yilam Chasto. The next verse in Hebrew is Yomru Gu'ulei Hashem Asher Ga'alam Mi'atzar. Those who are redeemed by God shall show how he redeemed them from the hands of the enemy, of the oppressor. Why that psalm? Of all the things they could have recited, why a biblical verse? Of all the biblical verses, why a verse in Psalms? Of all the Psalms, why Psalm 107? The answer is because they were Hebraists. We know, in fact, from one of the most popular commentaries, biblical commentaries, that the Pilgrims possessed and handed down to their heirs, because we know from probate courts what they handed down, was a commentary, a biblical commentary by a man named Henry Ainsworth. Henry Ainsworth was a Hebraic scholar. His favorite rabbinic line, which he used to structure his entire commentary, was Shivim Panim LaTorah. There's 70 faces to the Torah, and you can interpret it in many different ways. He thought that was the genius of the Jews. He was also an enormous fan of Maimonides. And in his commentary on Psalm 107, which we know is handed down, those copies of this commentary are handed down to the Pilgrims' heirs. In his commentary on Psalm 107, he says, he quotes a line from Maimonides. He says, this psalm is recited upon the following occasions: when you are released from prison, when you cross a desert, when you cross an ocean. To this very day, we in the Jewish community, we recite this. It's Birkas HaGomel. This is the blessing upon making a journey. And he says,
we predated that, obviously.
predated that. This goes back to the goes back to the Talmud. It's codified by Maimonides.
Exactly.
And
now
Ainsworth
he's saying
is quoting
Birkat
the law, and he says Maimonides says, based on the Talmud, when do you recite this psalm?
We cross the sea.
When you make a sea crossing.
Yeah.
So when the pilgrims cross the sea and they disembark at Plymouth and they recite Psalm 107, it's because they are saying Birkas HaGomel. That's why they're doing it.
That is wild.
Now, you asked the exact right question. This is great, but they're doing
curious
this
because you're describing a golden age of Jewish ideas.
Yes, they're doing this without Jews.
There's a golden age for Jewish people.
They're doing this without Jews. Okay. Right? Where are the Jews?
We just ask them questions when we need to.
Yeah, as Dara Horan says, people love dead Jews.
Yeah.
Okay. So where are the Jews?
Yeah.
Okay. I mentioned earlier Ezra Stiles, who's the guy who gets the first Zohar.
Right.
He's the guy.
Yale and Brown.
Yale and Brown.
Okay.
Fine. I was bothered by the question that you asked, like really bothered.
Yeah.
It's like, where are the Jews?
Yeah.
Stiles, before he became the president of Yale, before he founded Brown, before he became, and he was one of the most influential Congregationalist ministers in all of pre-revolutionary and revolutionary America. His followers were some of the founding fathers, constitutional signatories, state constitutional signatories. Before he was all that, he was a minister of a small but influential parish in Rhode Island.
Okay.
Right down the block from him is what we now know today as the Touro Synagogue.
Okay.
The rabbi of the Touro Synagogue, who overlapped with Ezra Stiles for about 11 months, was a man by the name of Rav Rafal Chaim Yitzchak Karagal. He was actually born in Hebron, in the city of Hebron.
Okay.
He was a colleague of the Chida, for example, one of the great figures of Jewish intellectual history. He made his way in order to collect money on behalf of the beleaguered and impoverished Jewish community in Palestine at the time. Now, what we knew then and all along, and now is the land of Israel. He makes his way to first Europe, then the Caribbean, and then eventually to what would become America. And he becomes, for 11 months, the rabbi of this congregation. Ezra Stiles fell in love with this guy. So Ezra Stiles, who's a massive Hebraist and is studying Jewish texts, is this guy is right out of all the books I've ever read.
Sure.
He goes to his sermons, even the ones that are delivered in Ladino, right, like a Spanish Jewish, like the Yiddish of. So he's going to his sermons. He's getting them translated. He's enamored with this guy. And as I remember looking through Ezra Stiles' personal journal, and he writes about many times, all the times that he would invite Rabbi Karagal to his study, or he would go visit Rabbi Karagal. And every time he's about to write what they talked about, if you look in the published version of the journal, there's an ellipsis and it cuts off, and then it goes on to the next thing. And I'm like, that's weird.
Yeah.
What's going on? So I was like, I need to find the handwritten copy because I feel like there are pages that have either been censored or are missing. So the original copy of the book is held in the Beinecke Rare Book Room at Yale. So I wrote to the Beinecke Rare Book Room at Yale and I was like, can I have access to this? I figured no one's ever asked them to this. What do they even need this thing for? They could just give it to me.
Yeah.
And they wrote me back something along the lines of, never in a million billion years, we'll kill you if you get anywhere near this library. And even if we do deign to give you, it'll be 5 years until you get access to this. I was heartbroken.
Wow.
So I actually tweeted, and at the time it was still Twitter, I tweeted, does anyone have any connections at the Beinecke Rare Book Room? And where do you go if you're a Jew and you're in trouble and you need someone to help you? Who do you ask? So God, for sure.
Yeah.
But also Chabad. So I called up so someone jokingly tweeted at me why don't you ask Chabad? And I was like, it's actually not a bad idea. So I called the Chabad rabbi at Yale, and he was great. He was I know this guy who knows that guy who knows this guy who knows. So finally, I found a kid who had access to the book room, who was willing to go in for me, snapped a couple of WhatsApp pictures, and sent it to me before he got caught. And so I was able to get those pages. And when you read them, it's pages upon pages upon pages of them studying Jewish texts together.
Wow.
Serious, they're studying Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the great works of Jewish mysticism. They're studying the Talmud. It's nuts. Totally nuts.
Wow.
Fast forward 2.5 weeks before the Battle of Yorktown. Rabbi Karagal is now in the Caribbean. I think he's now in the Bahamas. Stiles is now the president of Yale. Yale had gone remote since the beginning of the revolution because there was a war. And now they have their first in-person commencement exercises ever in America. Since, it's the first commencement exercises since the revolution.
Wow.
He steps up to the podium to give the first commencement address in the American history of Yale, and he prepares his remarks in Hebrew. And he delivers his address in Hebrew. And in it, he writes something like, and it's like a weird stylized Hebrew that he kind of like was making up as he went along. He's like, I never merited to study at the feet of Elijah or pour water upon the feet of Rabbi Gamaliel, one of the great sages of the Talmudic period.
Sure.
But he says something like, Ki taron ha'or al ha'choshech, just as light is greater than darkness, so too have I benefited to learn from some great teachers, but yeter al kulam, but more than all of them, Rabbi Karagal. And this is what he said. And then he proceeds to lay out a vision for the entire higher educational superstructure of Yale, which would eventually become like the entire higher educational landscape of the world. And he says,
what?
The entirety of our learning should be based on what I learned from Rabbi Karagal.
Wow.
And to me, that's the both promise and potential, sometimes peril, but really opportunity that America represents within the Western story, which is the West has been like converging on this fascination with Jewishness, appreciation for Jewishness, respect for the Jewish intellectual tradition, and all the greats of this period all understand themselves within this tradition, but they are at the same time either keeping Jews at arm's length, or they are so comfortable around Jews, around Jewish ideas, because they don't actually have to be around real Jews. What America represents is the first scaled, successful experiment in both embracing great Jewish ideas and doing it with real live Jews as partners and as essential, integral partners in that experiment. And so the way I think about it is Thanksgiving begins with a Jewish prayer, a prayer that the Talmud and Maimonides bequeathed, as it were, unknowingly, but bequeathed to the Pilgrim Fathers. It continues with a commencement exercise, a commencement speech, one of the foundational texts in American higher educational life, that full-throatedly endorses study with real live Jews and learning from real live Jews, and continues to this day to be a place where, when it remembers itself, when America remembers what it is and what its destiny is, what its mission is, we, the Jewish people, actually have a central leadership role to play. America is at its worst when it forgets those things. So like whenever I hear people be like, oh, we have to fight anti-Semitism because like it's a canary in the coal mine, I'm like, okay, fine, maybe. I don't think that's a very compelling argument for people who aren't Jewish. But I actually think, ironically, in some ways that's like a too ambitious argument, but in other ways it's not ambitious enough. They're not fighting anti-Semitism in this country because it's bad for Jews, and it'll also be bad for you if you let it fester long enough. We're doing it because this country is an incoherent national catastrophe without the organizing principle of the Jewish intellectual tradition and the Jewish people who, both past and present, who helped make that real and preserved it. So if you want to understand what it means to be American, you need to understand the Jewish tradition. You need to be studying with Jewish people. That's the story of Thanksgiving.
Wow. Oh my God.
All right.
So much there. So much there. I think I'm trying to decide how to use the rest of our time. So I want to ask you, headline, give me the tweet here, but just, we don't in reality live in a world today where people, I haven't met, my friends in college were not studying Hebrew, certainly Jewish or not Jewish, let's say, for that matter. Yeah. Was there a sudden turn somewhere? Did God die? Did Judaism die? How did that leave?
So it ebbs and flows.
Yeah.
It ebbs and flows. Yeah. I would say every great and successful social, even progressive revolution in the history of American life has been driven by the Hebrew Bible. So you can think of the American Revolution. You can think of emancipation in the Civil War. I mean, Frederick Douglass is probably, along with Abraham Lincoln, the greatest biblical commentator in American history.
Wow.
You can think of Martin Luther King Jr. structuring his entire campaign around a vision of Moses struggling to reach the promised land. You can think of FDR and the rise of the New Deal as a response to as a very explicit and articulated as such response to the commercial financial vision of justice that the Hebrew Bible lays out. And you'll see, like, you read speeches from the time, it's all about the biblical vision for prosperity. You can think of Reagan as prosecuting the Cold War, deeply influenced by Jennings. You could think of the first moon landing, or so you could think of rather the first broadcast from the Apollo flight that is the first human flight to orbit the Earth. On Christmas Day, I believe it's 1965.
Okay.
There's the Christmas Day. It's known as the Christmas Day broadcast. The first words that human beings speak from space back to Earth after they've orbited for the first time, they just read the first couple of verses of Genesis. That's it.
Wow.
You could think of Barack Obama. His most important speech that kind of catapults him is his Joshua generation speech, right? We're the generation that is the Joshua generation. Moses got us to the edge of the promised land but never made it over. We're the ones who are going to take. Like, you could think of everything. So Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, progressives, Whigs, Jeffersonian, like, you could think of everybody in the American experience who's ever tried to make something real and positive happen, even incrementally. They've done it on the engine of the Hebrew Bible. So we are a people as Americans who are deeply invested in that history, whether we all consciously know it or not. And I think now we're actually living in an age that is. I mean, this has happened like periodically throughout American history. You'll get like great awakenings, right? So you have one even before the American founding. You have one on the eve of the Civil War. And you have one in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. We're seeing one now. Like, all the data is pointing at it. Gen Z, like young Americans, like normal young Americans, are beginning to take their faith seriously at rates that were unprecedented for the last 20 years. We're starting to see that, and you're starting to see it in pop culture also. You know, like, if I think about who are like the pop culture icons of like when we were growing up. So like, Compton's the capital of hip hop. Who's big in Compton? Snoop Dogg, Tupac, Dr. Dre. Who's big outside of hip hop? NSYNC, Backstreet Boys, Britney Spears. Who's big in sports? Jordan, Barkley, Mia Hamm, you know, won a gold medal in women's soccer. Like, what they all have in common? I mean, I don't know. I honestly don't even know. Definitely not religion. Mm-hmm. I mean, some of them may have been religious, just we wouldn't know. It wasn't their brand. Fast forward like 35 years to today. So Compton's still the capital of hip hop. Who are the big artists out of Compton? Kendrick Lamar, Big Sean. Who are the big artists outside of hip hop? I mean, even within hip hop, Chance the Rapper. You have Bieber, Tori Kelly, Carrie Underwood. In sports, you have Steph Curry, Jason Tatum. You have, you know, young kids who are major TikTok influencers who are playing sports. Isaac and Eli Ellis. You have the biggest fitness influencers, Christian Huff, Luke Parker. You have some of the biggest, literally the biggest Instagrammers, TikTokers, and YouTubers in the world. What do they all have in common? Christian. They are non-denominational Christians. Now, they're not evangelicals, they're not Catholics, they're non-denominational Christians. They're typically not going to a house of worship or on a regular basis, or at least the same house of worship. It's like a shtiebel mentality. Mm-hmm. They're not necessarily developing a close relationship with their local pastor who's their primary point of contact. What do you find? You go on TikTok and you can find at any time of day like 100,000 kids just doing live Bible study. Literally any time of day you can find that. It's bananas. Why? Because all their icons are showing that this is a huge part of their brand. Like, you can line up any major pro, college, high school, you know, affiliate athlete with a major social following, like line up all those names on a wall right over here and throw a dart. 95 times out of 100, you're gonna hit someone who, if you look in their TikTok bio, has a Bible verse there. So we're living in a society that is rediscovering, I think by necessity, the joy, the hope, and even the responsibility that comes along with faith. And because of that, I think we're actually in for a really exciting next generation of American life, notwithstanding whatever you see in the news on a daily basis.
Wow. Okay. Our final question to bring us home now. BZ Media, the work that you're doing ties into everything you've said so far, but just tell our audience a little bit about what you're doing.
So our thesis is that we want to bring Israel content and great Jewish ideas to audiences outside the Jewish community, because to reach people within the Jewish community, that's important. We need to give ourselves comfort. We need to uplift ourselves. We need to give ourselves chizuk, as you might say, like we need to strengthen ourselves. But ultimately, like, we're already convinced. So how do you reach people outside the community? Well, what do we know about audiences outside the Jewish community? A couple things. Number one, they overwhelmingly get their content from new media. So, TikTok, Snapchat, Instagram, YouTube. Number two, we know the data tells us this overwhelmingly. They do not care about Israel, Palestine, Gaza, blah, blah, blah. You'll see protests on college campuses. You're seeing a tiny number of kids. Every single good quality poll that we have from Harvard, from Reuters, from Ipsos, from Axios, they're all telling us the same thing. Young people do not care. They're not voting on it, they're not interested in it, they're not reading about it, they're not learning about it. And in a world of algorithmic social media, you don't have to read about it. Just because something's on the front page of the New York Times or on screen 24 hours a day on CNN doesn't matter to you, because you're being served up what you want to see. So if you want to see video gaming, you want to see fashion, you want to see beauty, you want to see sports, you'll only see that. You won't see anti-Israel stuff, but you won't see pro-Israel stuff either. And number three, what do we know about this young generation? They're non-denominational Christians, overwhelmingly young American kids. So we asked ourselves, okay, how do we reach that group of kids? They're on new media, they're not interested in the politics of Israel, Palestine, Gaza, whatever, and they're non-denominational Christians. The answer is obvious. You want to work with major content creators who are non-denominational Christians and who want to see that revivifying, that revitalizing of spiritual and moral life in America and take it seriously in their own lives and are massively influential content creators. And you want to say to them, hey, let's engage with Israel in a way where, like, the mistake that we typically make as a community is we always make ourselves the main character in Israel engagement. So we'll take people to Yad Vashem, and we'll take people to see Kfar Aza, and we'll take people to see the Nova site, and we'll take people to see, again, there's nothing wrong with that. And if that's something that you're interested in, you should go. And as a Jewish person, like someone who cares, I've been to all those places. They're powerful. But if you are not connected to our story in any way, then doing that is not seeing those places is not fundamentally different than going to the site of a Cherokee massacre, or going to, Haiti, or going to wherever, or going to see post-war, like, Cambodia or whatever, right? It just says you're not the main character, so you're not invested in it. But what we also can do is we can take you to Israel, and what we can say and mean is, you wake up every single morning, TikToker, and the first thought on your mind is, how do I create a closer relationship with God? The God that you want a closer relationship with is the God of the Bible. He's a God whose promises have structured our entire civilization. His promises of restoration, his promises of prosperity, of the rewards for obedience. If you want to understand how the entire story of your life, your civilization, your God came to be, you need to go to the place where it's set. If you want to understand how the words on all the stories you've ever read aren't just words on a page, they're actually real, you need to step into those stories. So we'll take you to the Holy Land. And we're not going to see Yad Vashem, and we're not going to see the tunnels on the northern border, and we're not going to see Kibbutz Be'eri. Those are important, but maybe you'll go on a different trip. What we're going to do is we're going to see Jerusalem, we're going to see the Galilee, we're going to see the cave of the patriarchs and the matriarchs in Hebron. We're going to see the valley of Elah, where David fought Goliath. We're going to see the room where David and Solomon wrote Psalms and Proverbs. We're going to see the most important things in your life, and we're going to create content that fits with your channel already. So if you're like a fitness influencer and your favorite story, the one that inspires you the most every morning, is David versus Goliath, we'll take you to the spot where David fought Goliath, and we will make the kind of content there with you that we can co-post together that introduces your audience that has never even thought about Israel. For the first time is going to introduce you to Israel in a way that is totally organic to what they're looking for. They're following you for fitness content. This is fitness content, but it has Israel in it in a positive, civilizationally affirming way. So the way we think about it is, this is a win for everybody. It's a win for America, because America desperately needs this spiritual revolution. And this is a way for us as a as a country and us, the Jewish people, as a nation, to bet on the best in the American spirit. It is a plus for the American Jewish people because it gives us a way to engage with culture in a way we've really never been able to before. And it's a plus for Israel because it allows Israel to put itself in a really wholesome way at the epicenter of pop culture in a way that can reach literally hundreds of millions of people. So we're really proud that this year through our content, we're able to reach over 250 million views. And that was just getting started. And what we've been able to do is in the months since, whenever we take major content creators to Israel, that's just the beginning. What we do then afterwards is we're doing regular Hebrew Bible study with them. We're in conversation about Israel. We're in conversation about all these different things. I mean, it's just, we have an opportunity as a people to shape society, to influence massive numbers of young audience members, young viewers, and we can reach them through their faith. And we have a chance to set up Israel for incredible success in the generation to come.
Wow. Amazing. So inspiring. Such a different way of thinking about the challenges the Jewish people are facing. Very innovative, very powerful. So many things to take from this interview. I want to bring us to a close because of time, but thinking about the first story with your grandfather and then hearing about how we kind of got to the first Thanksgiving and the way that Jewish ideas were at the bedrock of coming to America, establishing the government of America, establishing the university system of America is wild. And then thinking about the way to actually, think about, let's call it, how to think about Israel, not by saying that accusation you heard is not true and let me tell you why, but instead saying, let me bring you to the Valley of Elah to see what happened with David and Goliath. What a different way of thinking. Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm, this is such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
You're amazing. Thank you so much for having me.
And happy Thanksgiving to you and to all.